Watch Harrisburg School District's final audit review and financial update presentation. Learn how our district is allocating funds and resources to support the innovative teaching and learning of our students.
I'd like to take a few minutes to review our recently completed audit by our auditors at BBD. I'll be making some opening remarks about our audit. Then I'd like to do a financial update on where the current fiscal year is and how things stand with preparations for next year's budget. As Mr. Sulmer said, I'll make a few comments about the ESSER funding. That's a big topic of concern with public schools, given the size of that funding. And then we'll talk about next steps, and Mr. Sulmer will join me with some of his thoughts and comments. So the highlights of our recently completed audit, and this is very positive news for the school district, our fund balance. We contributed and added to our fund balance. You can see, if you refer to the audit report, it's added to our agenda tonight. It's on page 17 of the actual audit. It's on page 20 of the PDF. We have a total general fund balance of $21.8 million. That's an increase of $6.4 million. Much of this increase, of course, is because of COVID. There were some extenuating circumstances, of course, but this is very positive, and this is a change from recent years. The team worked very hard to contribute to those results. But again, this is a very good result for the district. Our unassigned fund balance is at $10.7 million. This is an increase from about $5 million last year. The other point I'd like to make here, which is very important, this is a change from last year, and I'll elaborate here in just a minute. We set up special reserves of $1 million each for healthcare and for enrollment stabilization. Mr. Nornhold, if you can move to the next slide. This is the first slide of our balance sheet. I'd point out two things here. You'll see these are the assets and liabilities for the district. There are three major funds. There's a general fund, capital projects fund, and debt service fund. You can see there's a comparison with 2020 and 2019. We've improved in all of those areas. The liabilities are on the bottom part of this page. Mr. Nornhold, if you could go to the next page. This is the bottom part of the assets and fund balance section. I highlighted with a circle here. This is the most important part for our purposes this evening. You'll see there in the committed fund balance section, our athletic and balance for band reserves is $500,000. That's still established there. There's an assigned section for capital improvements of $7 million. That's very important given some of the capital needs in the school district. And then the two funds that I mentioned, the $1 million each for healthcare and enrollment stabilization. We as a team felt it was important to establish this, given some of the pressure from the COVID and some of the fluctuations we've been seeing with enrollment. And it's just, I think, a prudent move given some of the surplus that we had. It's important to set that aside. So that's how our fund balance breaks down for this fiscal year. If we dig a little bit deeper into how those numbers are created for the district, we'll look at revenues first. I think we all know how our revenues are broken out. We have local, state, and federal revenues. Our locals, they're really above budget due to the stronger than expected collections in property tax, earned income tax, and delinquent occupation tax. The situation is that due to the efforts of the team before COVID really took hold, the district was doing better in all of these areas than it had been in the past. However, in the last quarter of the fiscal year, that's when COVID started to really hit. So there were some effects there that were felt in some of the other areas of the district, namely in the state and federal funding. So I'll talk about those in just a minute. Next slide, please. In expenses, we were actually $12 million under budget for instruction and support services. This is due to a number of unfilled positions, either due to COVID effects or market conditions. Also, we had a positive health care benefit variance here. And again, this was a positive trend in healthcare marketplace and also the COVID effect that we've talked about. That fourth quarter of the fiscal year, we saw that there was less utilization in the healthcare marketplace due to a hesitancy to seek out healthcare services due to people staying away from hospitals and doctors' offices. We also saw a significant savings in transportation due to savings with fuel and not utilizing contract services because schools were not in service. Next slide. I highlighted these areas. These are the breakdowns in the budgetary comparison schedule. Those are on page 49 of the audit and page 53 of the PDF. You'll see the local, state, and federal sources. Our local is actually significantly above our final projected budget. Our actual is at $59.2 million. It's a $3 million variance to our final approved budget. The state sources, and again, this is important to understand this context because our state sources are derived, a significant amount of that is derived from subsidy that's tied directly to employment with reimbursement due to retirement and Social Security. When we have open positions, we don't get that subsidy that is budgeted due to a fully employed staff. So those shortfalls are tied to either retirement funding that's not utilized when we don't have those filled positions, or Social Security subsidy that we don't receive due to those unfilled positions. And when you look down at the expenditure line item that I circled, you'll see instruction regular programs. We had a very significant variance to final budget there. Those positions were not filled, therefore we didn't receive the subsidy. So that's where those two work in tandem. It's important to understand that there. Next slide, please. This is just indicating what the variance is in the savings. It's a $12 million total savings in the expenditure area, actual to budget. You'll see at the bottom, these are net changes in our fund balance, and they just reflect some of the changes in our transfers in and out of for debt service and those other factors throughout our budget. Next slide, please. I wanted to make a point about our food service fund. This is something that is slowly improving. However, the food service fund is still in a deficit. We have traditionally the district has outsourced this in an effort to try to improve this area of operations. Our team is hard at work looking to improve. The general fund cannot continue to subsidize this. It's something that Mr. Selmer and I and Mr. Glass have been focusing on. You'll notice that the change in net position, which is a deficit, there's a significant improvement here. That's primarily due to, if you look at the salary and wages and employee benefits, those areas and those two line items under operating expenses have dramatically improved. But again, that's due to a difference in some positions not being filled, and also the change in healthcare and not utilizing some of those benefits and not having to spend what we did with healthcare as we did in the past. Important point to remember here is that we're still running a loss, almost $100,000. We're about an $85,000 loss. And if you look in the balance sheet for food service, it's page 21, page 24 of the PDF. I did not include it on this slide or in this PowerPoint. There's still a significant deficit, and it's a significant amount that the food service fund owes to the general fund. It's almost $1.5 million. So that is an accumulated deficit over time that the general fund is owed from food service. That's something that we need to rectify over time, and we will do it, but it's something that's important, and I wanted to bring it up to everyone as we reviewed the results here tonight. So switching over to the current fiscal year, I wanted to present where we are right now. We're having a positive year in terms of how we're measuring our actual results versus budget. We're right on budget. You see here, this is a very high level snapshot. Our revenues are right in line with where we expect them to be at this time of year. Our actual revenues are 63% to budget. So we brought in just over $100 million of revenue. This is all three levels, local, state, and federal revenues. You'll see where our expenses are. You might ask yourself, why don't they match up the revenue to expense? Why don't they match? Well, it's really important to remember that revenues start on July 1st and end on June 30th. They run on the fiscal year that way. Expenses are slightly different. Some of our expenses run on a July to June calendar, but many of our costs, including our teachers' salaries, run, and we have a deferred compensation model. Because teachers are paid over the summer, we pay those teacher salaries in July and August. So many of those costs, we have to account for those and pay those in a way that we pay those payroll costs in July and August and then account for them back into the previous fiscal year. So that's why you see that little bit of a gap. And it's important to understand that those numbers will never match up until the end of the fiscal year when we do our final accounting. Wanted to bring that point up and make sure that everyone understood that. Next slide, please. Some points about our fiscal situation in the current fiscal year regarding revenues. This year, the revenues trending positively, given some of the doom and gloom that everyone was forecasting when COVID first occurred. We were actually very concerned about this. You might remember some of the IFO from the state, the Independent Fiscal Office, some of the PASBO and PSBA data that was coming out. We were trying to forecast and really be proactive and look at some of these things. Well, some of them haven't really come out as negatively as what it was projected to possibly be. We have some cautious optimism in local taxes. Earned income tax especially is not as bad as what it might have been. It's not saying that it's really rosy, but it's not necessarily as bad as what it could have been when initial forecasts were out there. Property tax is above what our most conservative projections were initially forecast for. The one thing that's really important here is our fund balance is starting to build. In a normal interest rate environment, we would start to generate some real interest earnings, which would be natural growth. We'd be able to pay for some positions with interest earnings. However, in this almost a 0% interest rate environment, we're not generating any interest. So there's very little interest rate earnings for us. That's really a shame because as we're starting to regenerate our fund balance, we would have an opportunity in a normal environment to actually start to pay for some things on our own. So that's the situation with local taxes and local revenue. The state revenue, we're essentially on budget. I think the team has done a good job in forecasting there. We didn't do anything overly aggressively, but our forecast is right on budget. And again, the important thing to remember with state numbers, we are tied on some of those big buckets of funding to employment. So when we have more open positions, some of those numbers will trend down, specifically retirement and Social Security. When we're fully staffed, those revenue numbers will come in right on forecast. The challenge is in an environment that's so competitive with hiring, it's just some of those positions will be open. So we expect to be a little bit under budget on the state, but we're also going to be under budget on the expense side. So that's not as big of an issue for state hitting those numbers as it would be perhaps on the local level for local revenues. The federal revenues, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. That's really a situation that's in flux because of some of the ESSER funding. We talked about that in a previous meeting last month, but we have some more information, but there's a lot more work to do there. I'll talk more about that in a few slides. Next slide, please. Expenses. Again, there are positive trends here. We've really focused on cost control, being very careful and prudent and good stewards of taxpayer funds here. Our salaries and benefits are on trend and we're on budget. We're putting in our internal procedures, making sure that we're hiring as needed. Charter schools enrollments seem to be up. They're slightly above our budget. However, I think that's to be expected given the COVID environment. We're carefully monitoring all of those costs, and we're making sure that we're verifying all of those student enrollments and making sure that we only pay what we're obligated to pay. Federal programs, those numbers are below budget because of COVID, and we're revising all of those budgets, and we expect to have carryover for the next year. We submitted revised spending plans for this year, and that's for this funding year with the eye towards next year and how we're going to utilize that funding, not only with some of our title funding, but how that will meld and work with some of the ESSER funding that we're obligated to spend on learning loss for next year. We want those to work seamlessly together. The team has been working on those plans so our students don't miss a beat. And then the last part on expenses, facilities and capital improvements, that's essential. We need to have great facilities for our students to learn in and our teachers and staff to work in. And that's all part of ESSER, and we need to make sure that we comply with all federal regulations, make sure that we handle these dollars appropriately. We're still planning. We want to be careful with this, make sure we do everything appropriately and meet all regulations. We have a lot of ideas and a lot of needs. We want to make sure that we do this, and we're being very planful in this area. So let's talk a little bit more about the ESSER funding. I think everyone knows there are really three tranches of this funding. ESSER 1 was released last year as part of the CARES relief package. ESSER 1, the district received almost $5 million of funding. Part of that was allocated for non-public schools. Harrisburg's allocation of that was $4.7 million. ESSER 2 is almost $26 million. And ESSER 3, which is also known as the American Rescue Plan, we call it ESSER 3, just it's a little bit simpler to refer to that. The district's receiving almost $53 million of funding there. The challenge in managing this amount of funding is the time frame. Typically, with this amount of funding, we'd have a little bit more time. But the expiration date for this funding, it starts on September 30th, 2023. And then there's another extension of a year due to a special federal provision that allows for ESSER 2 and 3 to be extended for an extra year. So really, we only have about 3 years to spend almost $85 million. So that's why it's extremely important for us to be very careful and plan for this. Our team right now is looking at an approach of almost, in a way, even though we can't really do it this way, we're having sort of the mindset of having two separate budgets, because it's in order for us to not walk ourselves in 3 years into a funding cliff, not tying these funds in any way to a recurring or ongoing salaries and benefits. It's really important that we try to be careful with this, because this is one-time funding. It's not something that we can rely on to fund personnel or salaries or people that will be here after this funding goes away. With some of the uses of the ESSER funds, all of these items here, and I'm not going to try to read all of these things, but this is right off of the language that's in the statute. This is the language from ESSER 1. And ESSER 2 and 3 build off of the language here. But this is all around mitigation of COVID, learning loss, enhancement of technology, purchasing of technology for students, and then anything that helps LEAs and schools to maintain operations in the event of a disruption. That's the essence of ESSER 2 or ESSER funding. On the next slide, and this is very concise, the uses of ESSER 2 and 3 are either identical or extremely similar to ESSER 1. There's two main differences for ESSER 2 and 3. The first one is there's no non-public set aside. In ESSER 1, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, we had to set aside dollars for non-public schools that we work with for other title dollars. There's no provision in the law that we have to do that. So all of this funding that is coming to the school district is Harrisburg's to use. The second thing, and Mr. Selmer mentioned this briefly in his introductory comments, ESSER 3 has a requirement that 20%, which is over $10 million of the ESSER 3 grant, has to go to address learning loss. Now, that could mean anything, and our team is putting together plans on exactly what that will, how that will look and what that will encompass. So, having said all that, there's a lot there that we have to unpack and prepare for as we start preparing for the 21-22 budget. In a normal year, we would be in a situation where we would be finalizing the first draft of the New Year's budget. But by all accounts, this is not a normal year. Our budget is a work in process. I think we're in a good situation because we have a very positive situation with the audit that finished. Our current year is trending very positively, but I think it's really important that, and I'm recommending to Dr. Samuels, that we really need to have a better idea of what we're going to do with some of the ESSER funding so we can finalize that and start to plan out what's happening in the next few years before we can lock in some things on the current year's budget. This is a generational opportunity to address critical needs in Harrisburg. Our students are in some areas and in some respects underfunded. They have some really pressing needs, and this is a way that we can perhaps take some initial steps to address some of those needs. Some big parts that are still in movement and in motion for us to address or to at least consider as we're preparing the new budget. We're still in negotiations with HEA, with our teachers union. We're still negotiating with AFSCME, which is a support staff union. We're still in early steps with meeting and discussing with our Act 93 or administrators group. And finally, and I think I want to elaborate a little bit more on this, we still need to determine a path forward on taxes. Now, before everyone starts to say, wait a minute, George, you just talked about almost $90 million of federal funds. How could you possibly think about raising taxes when the district's getting all this money. Just hear me out. And I want to talk just very briefly about that. If you could go to the next slide, please. Local property taxes are one of the main components of funding a school district. We are in a very challenging environment, and we were in a challenging environment about 10 years ago, although not nearly as challenging, I would say, as we are right now. I'll use the term a cliff, a funding cliff, because in 2008, our country was faced with the Great Recession. At the end of President Bush's term in office, we had the housing crisis, we had the meltdown of Lehman Brothers, the bank collapsed, and there were a lot of things that happened in our economy. And when President Obama came in, he put some things into place, and there was some significant funding that went to public schools. We don't want to have a lot of the negative fallout that happened to some schools when a lot of the funding that was put into schools and ended because school districts made maybe some unwise choices at that time. The funding is not necessarily bad. It's the decisions that are made with the funding that maybe are not the best. We want to make sure we make the best decisions now, like I said earlier, not funding people in positions that will be here when the funding ends. We want to fund things that will fix needs now, not funding people that will be here and then we have to figure out how to pay for them when the funding ends. The other thing that has to be really carefully considered is we don't want to, and I have it quoted here on the slide, we don't want to stand still regarding local tax revenue if the state decides to flat fund Harrisburg School District. There are conversations ongoing right now because of this significant amount of federal funding that's coming in, that perhaps the Commonwealth will not be funding school districts during this period of time. There are people who are saying, well, if the feds are going to fund these schools, the Commonwealth doesn't need to. Well, if that happens, we need to figure out how do we come in and at least make sure we're not treading water for these next up until 23, 24. So we want to make sure on the financial side, we provide our educational administrators with minimal disruption to the educational process once ESSER expires. That is our goal. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we are being very respectful, and we want to be very sensitive to taxpayers who are paying these bills. These taxpayers have needs, and we want to make sure that we do that. So, having said that, these are the next steps in our budgetary process. Next month, we'll be presenting to Dr. Samuels a draft and the proposed final budget of the 21-22 draft. And then in June, on June 14th, we'll have a virtual budget workshop to update everyone in the public on what that budget looks like, because we'll be tinkering and making some changes ongoing. This won't be one of those years where we just sort of draft and then it doesn't really change between when we present the proposed final and the final. I have a feeling there'll be some things that change quite a bit as we go. June 21st, we'll ask the receiver to adopt the final budget. We'll have continuing dialogue in May and June on what this budget looks like. We'll make sure we involve the entire team, building principals, HEA, AFSCME, other stakeholders, specifically around what this ESSER funding looks like. And then over the summer, we'll have instruction. We'll be having conversations and meeting over what the opening for fall looks like. And then, of course, COVID, the numbers still are not down to zero. That's what we all want. And, we'll continue to monitor that so we have a safe opening in August when our students come back for the new school year.
This has been a presentation of the Harrisburg School District.